Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, welcome back. We're continuing with the argument from dependency, and now what we're going to do in this section is we're going to take a look at some of the objections that are put forth in regards to this particular argument. Now, the very first objection is that an atheist may turn around and say, when you make this argument, that the universe exists independently, right? So they may turn around and say, well, if you're saying that God is independent and necessary, why cannot we say the same thing for the universe itself? Now, if they say this, well, they haven't really been paying attention to the argument itself. We've explained why the universe is not necessary, right? We've defined what dependency means. We've taken a look at the universe, and therefore we've concluded that the universe is not necessary, it's dependent. So this is a misplaced contention for the following reasons. Firstly, there is nothing necessary about the universe. It could have not existed, as we determined this. The universe did not have to exist. Secondly, the components of the universe could have been arranged in a different way. Whether one considers these components to be quarks or some other type of quantum field, it still raises the question, why are they arranged in the way that they are? So the fundamental building blocks of the universe are arranged in a particular way. They did not have to be arranged in that way. They could have been arranged in any other way. And if they are arranged in that way, that means that something outside of the universe arranged the universe in the way that it has been arranged, highlighting again that the universe is dependent. So this particular contention is one which emerges from one not paying attention to the argument that's being made. And a key thing to keep in mind here, brothers and sisters, is when you're making these arguments, try to make sure that the person that you're engaging with is actually listening to you and not just drifting off somewhere else or just manufacturing a response to give back to you. Try to really sort of every so often check in with them and ask them, does that make sense? Do I need to clarify anything? Because such situations or such contentions emerge when people don't listen to the argument that you're presenting. Objection number 2, the universe is a brute fact. Now someone may turn around and say, well, yeah, I don't like, just because they don't like the particular argument, they just turn around and say, well, the universe is just a brute fact. It just is. We don't need to think about it. It just is. Well, that's not really an answer. That's a cop-out, essentially. They're trying to get away from having to acknowledge the argument. Because look, let's put it this way, it's human nature. We do this in science all the time. We're always looking to understand why things are the way they are, what explains them. And science deals with dependent things, and the universe is a dependent thing, as we've concluded. And science does, and it should, and it continues to look for answers as far as the origins of the universe are concerned. So to call it a brute fact is not helping anyone. It's just trying to run away from facing the point, the reality in regards to the universe and what we've concluded from this argument. Now imagine, I'll give you a scenario for example. Imagine you're walking down, you're going for a walk in the park with a friend or colleague that's atheist. And as you're walking, you see this hovering, glowing blue ball right in the middle, maybe like 3 feet wide, and it's just hovering in thin air and it's glowing. You don't just walk past and say, well, yeah, it just is. It's just a brute fact. No, of course not. Immediately as a human being, you're going to start to inquire, you're going to start to ask questions. Well, why does this exist? Where did this come from? What is this? Is this an alien UFO? We don't know. What is it? Right? So it's because the blue ball didn't have to be there. It didn't have to be hovering so many feet off the ground, be such a size, be such a color, and all of these things. And that tells us that the blue ball hovering in midair in the park is dependent. And as soon as you realize this, immediately you would go to now find out, well, why is it the way it is? Do we explain this, right? So you know that it's dependent on something outside of itself. Now just expand this blue ball out to the size of the universe. Same questions apply. So we can still ask the question. So just turning around and saying the universe is a brute fact, that's it, move on, it's not really an answer. And it's not really being intellectually honest. Objection number 3, science will eventually find an answer. Sure, the universe is dependent, therefore must be dependent on something outside of itself, but science will find an answer. We're not going to acknowledge that it's God, this necessary being is a creator, is God, etc. Well, there's a problem with this type of response. Firstly, the argument from dependency or contingency is not a scientific argument or empirical argument, it's a metaphysical argument. It works with first principles. So that in and of itself, it's not a question for science necessarily from this perspective. Secondly, all that science can do is provide answers that will refer to phenomena that are dependent. Science is dependent upon observations. Science can only observe physical things with limited physical qualities, things that exist within this particular universe. So science will always be limited from this perspective. Science cannot engage with or study or understand something that's necessary, because everything within this physical material universe is dependent, as we've concluded. So the being that's beyond this, the necessary being that's responsible for this dependent existence and everything that we perceive, which is dependent, science has no say in it. Science can't tell you anything directly about this being or this necessary reality. Science cannot point to something that necessarily exists, and that's a very important point to keep in mind as well. So this whole thing about science will give us an answer, it doesn't work with the argument from dependency. Objection number 4, the fallacy of composition. So the point here is, the objector may argue that the universe is not dependent even though it is made up of dependent or contingent parts. The particular fallacy here, the fallacy of composition, is essentially saying, well, just because something is made up of certain parts, it doesn't mean that the whole has to be display the same quality. So just because the universe is made up of dependent parts, it doesn't mean that the universe itself is dependent. Now, it's a misplaced contention. It's a misplaced fallacy, because it works sometimes and it doesn't. But there's a principle of dependency that we need to keep in mind, that individual dependent things, when they make up a whole, that whole is also dependent. So individual dependent parts make up a dependent whole. This is a principle, and if anyone argues against this and says no, dependent things, when they can make up a necessary whole, well, the onus of proof is on them. They have to now go and establish this. Because what we know based on this principle is that dependent things, when they come together, in whichever way they do, and formulate a whole, that whole is always dependent. However, just exploring this sort of analogy further and highlighting where sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, if you take, for example, a Persian rug. A Persian rug is heavy. They're massive, huge rugs, right? Now, the whole rug itself, the whole is heavy. But its individual parts, the strands and the threads that it's made up of, are relatively extremely light. So in that case, the fallacy itself applies, it works. But if you take another example, take a brick wall. An individual brick, each one of those individual bricks that make up the whole wall are hard. The whole wall is hard. So there are times when the fallacy works and the times when the fallacy doesn't, but when it comes to dependent things, or the argument of dependency, the fallacy does not work, because we know the principle of dependency, which is that dependent parts always make up dependent wholes. So this particular fallacy is misplaced. Objection number 5, you've assumed God's existence, right? Now, let's break this down. The argument has not made up the idea of necessity in order to lead to God. This idea of necessary things and dependent things, it's there. These are philosophical ideas which exist. We're not just making up this idea of something that's necessary then to postulate that it's God, right? The dependency of the universe and everything that we perceive has led to the idea that there must be an eternal independent being that exists necessarily. This conclusion makes sense of the Islamic definition of God. So we've gone through a whole argument and we've established why the universe and everything that exists that is dependent must be dependent on an eternal necessary being. It's not something we just plucked out of thin air. And on top of this, when you look at the Islamic tradition, as we've gone through some of the examples, we see what we learn about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see that it's in line with what we know about this necessary being. There's nothing that we're trying to force or fudge to conclude God. It's something that we've gone through the process of logical deduction, we've gone through the argument, and we've come to the conclusion that everything that's dependent, everything that we perceive, the universe, is dependent, relies upon a necessary being. We've also conceptualized some other aspects of this necessary being, some other conclusions that we can come to, and then we've taken this and reflected upon the Islamic tradition. We've seen that this is in line with what we know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about God. He's as-Samad. He's the eternal being. He's the independent being. He is self-sufficient, self-subsisting. He doesn't require anything or anyone else. He's completely independent. He's eternal. He has no beginning. He has no end. Everything in existence is totally and utterly dependent upon Him. Well, it's merging. These two ideas, what we learn from this argument, is in line with what we learn from Islam. So it's not something that we're trying to fudge or make up. The idea of necessity and dependency are well known and discussed in philosophy. The use of the word dependency in this argument is usually referred to as contingency in philosophy. So again, it's not something we've plucked out of thin air. These are things that are well known and well discussed. Objection number 6. Doesn't God require an explanation? Now, if someone brings this particular contention, again, it's another silly one, because we have gone through the whole argument and they haven't been attentive. We have highlighted why, sure, you can say a dependent thing which requires an explanation because it's dependent can result in something else which is dependent. So you can say this universe was created by another universe which is dependent, but that dependent universe now requires an explanation because dependent things cannot sustain themselves in and of themselves. They require something external to themselves. And we've also highlighted why this, if you go on forever postulating dependent causes, leads to a chain of infinite regress which you can't traverse. So we've concluded, based on the argument, if, again, the person you speak to was attentive, they would realize that there must be a necessary eternal being, right? So this necessary eternal being doesn't require an explanation. Only dependent things require an explanation. A necessary being doesn't require an explanation. Technically, such a being doesn't require an explanation that refers to something external to it, unlike dependent things, as we've mentioned. The necessary being is explained by virtue of its own existence. In other words, it was impossible for it to have not existed. Therefore, it doesn't require an explanation external to itself, right? So again, just to reiterate the point, dependent things require an explanation because dependent things have limited physical qualities. They're arranged in a particular way. Therefore, they require something outside of themselves to explain their particular arrangement. But necessary things, or the necessary being, we're referring to something that could not have existed. Therefore, it doesn't require an explanation for its existence. So brothers and sisters, that's it for this session. In the next session, we're going to be concluding on a spiritual note, just to tie everything together, because we don't want to be abstract philosophers who make really good, strong, rational arguments, but leave people with a very dry concept of God, and we don't link it to the fundamental purpose behind all of this, which is to worship God. So in the next session, we'll touch upon this. When you're ready, move on to the next section.